In chapter 5, we'll be dealing with plant physiology, which is basically the study of the processes that takes place within the plant. In chapter 2, we looked at the internal structure of plants with cells and tissues and different organs. And in chapter 3, we looked at the morphology, or the study of the external structure, what the plant looks like on the outside. And then in chapter 4, we dealt with the reproduction processes and the formation of the new generation in the form of seeds. As I mentioned in chapter 5, we'll be looking at the things that happens inside the plant to make plant growth possible. And the first thing that we'll be dealing with is water relations in plants. The first thing that you need to know is what is the definition of plant physiology. And it is basically the study of reactions and processes that take place and part in the plant. And we'll be focusing on 3 different types of physiological processes. The first, as I just mentioned, is the movement of water through the plant. You all know hopefully by now that the roots absorb water. It is absorbed nowhere else in the plant. Water is only absorbed by the roots. And that water needs to move through the stem to the leaves in some way. And that is the focus of this session. The second physiological process that we'll be looking at is the movement of solids. So through the process of photosynthesis, for example, sugars are formed, and those sugars need to move from the leaves through the stems to the roots. And then the last physiological processes that we'll be looking at is chemical reactions. Things like hormones stimulating fruit ripening, for example. Water plays a very important part in plants, in the fact that firstly it provides support to a plant. So if you do not water a plant, that plant will wilt and eventually die. It is part of reactions. So if you take photosynthesis, for example, water is needed for the process of photosynthesis to take place. It is a solvent, so things like sugars are dissolved in the water. It has a transport function and then also a stabilizing function in plants. If you look at this picture here, it's just to show you what the effect is if you do not water plants. There's an experiment with blue buffalo grass where this plant here on the left hand side has received what's called 100% of the water that it needs. And you can see the plant has grown to the full potential. This plant here in the center has only received 50% of the water that it needs. And you can see this plant is looking a little bit sickly. While this plant here on the right only received 20% of the water that it needs, and you can see that it is in a dying state. So water is very important in plants for various reasons. But how does water move from the roots to the rest of the plant? That movement takes place through 2 different processes. The first one is called diffusion, and the second one is called osmosis. We'll be looking at the process of diffusion first, and that is basically the movement of a substance from a specific area where there's a large quantity to an area where there's a low quantity, and that movement happens spontaneously. So if a stink bomb is activated at the front of the class, the first person who would smell that is the person just sitting next to where it happened. And the person to smell that lastly will be the person sitting at the back of that classroom. And that is what diffusion is. There's nothing preventing those molecules of moving through the air. And it is a natural and spontaneous movement. So diffusion is when molecules of a substance occur in a greater quantity in one area. Those molecules will move to the area where there's a low quantity, and that movement will be spontaneous. So if you look at the picture here, there's a high quantity of a molecule over here, and it will move spontaneously through this whole system to an area where there was a low quantity. As you can see in this picture, the same thing, a high quantity of a molecule, and then it moves spontaneously to where there is a low quantity. The second process in which water can move through a plant is called osmosis. And osmosis is basically also a movement of water, but in this case, it is through a membrane. And it's also as a result in the difference of the concentration or the water potential. So if you look at the picture here, there's a membrane in the center of this beaker, and pure water on the left-hand side and a sugar solution on the right-hand side. This water will move from an area where there's a high concentration to an area where there's a low concentration. And this is what you can see here. The water has moved through this membrane to the area where there is a low concentration of water. The movement of water is very important in the process of turgor pressure. If you remember correctly, when we talked about the anatomy of plant cells, we talked about the vacuole, and one of the functions of the vacuole was to exert turgor pressure inside the cell. And you can again see it here. If this is a plant cell inside a plant, the cell vacuole is the part of that plant cell that holds water. So what turgor pressure is when water, through the process of osmosis, moves into this vacuole, and the vacuole swells like a balloon, and it exerts pressure on the cell wall on the outside. So that will cause a plant not to be wilted when you give it water. We'll get to that process now, but if you do not give a plant water, the water will move out of the cell vacuole because there is a high water potential within the cell vacuole and not on the outside, and that plant will start to wilt. As soon as you water it again, the water will move from the outside of the cell into the cell vacuole, and that vacuole will swell and have turgor pressure on the cell wall on the outside. The opposite process of turgor pressure is called plasmolysis, and that is, like I said, when water moves out of the cell and this cytoplasm and vacuole shrinks. You can see this is a normal cell, plant cell, with the chloroplasts inside. When water moves out of the cell through plasmolysis, the cell contents shrink because there's no water in it. The vacuole do not exert turgor pressure, and this plant will become wilted. So the relation of water in a plant is firstly the water is absorbed by the roots, then it moves through the xylem upwards in a plant, and because the water cannot stay in the plant forever, it needs to be released to the atmosphere again, and that process is called transpiration. When we looked at plant morphology and the morphology of leaves, I told you there's only two functions that leaves perform. The first is photosynthesis and the second is transpiration. And transpiration is the loss of water through the leaves via these stomata or air holes into the atmosphere. So the stomata opens. The stomata is the little pore on a leaf where gases for photosynthesis come in, and water is released to the atmosphere through transpiration. Transpiration is like a plant overheating and sweating. In some cases, transpiration is so high that the water is actually forced out of the leaf, and you can see this in these pictures here. The water are forced, and it is in the form of water drops. Transpiration happens mostly through gases, while this process of what we call guttation, that is when transpiration rate is so high that the water is actually forced from the leaves. How does these little air holes in a on a plant leaf, the stomata, how do they work? They work through the process of turgor pressure. So what happens is the stomata has got two bean-like guard cells on either side, and when you water the plant and the water moves into these cells, they become swollen and the opening becomes bigger. When the water moves out of the cells, of these guard cells, these cells become flaccid and the stomata closes. So you can see a closed stomata here and an open stomata with the guard cells surrounding it. There are environmental factors that influence transpiration. So what the environment looks like on the outside of the plant will influence how quickly or slowly transpiration happens inside a plant. And the first environmental factor is light. And you can see that if the light intensity, like early in the dark or early in the mornings, the rate of transpiration is very low. As the day grows lighter, as the sun shines brighter, this rate of transpiration increases. Then also atmospheric humidity, so how wet it is on the outside of the plant, also influences the rate of transpiration. So if there's a lot of water on the outside of the plant will not transpire as quickly. So if it's dry outside, that plant will transpire more quickly. There's also temperature. When the temperature is low, the rate of transpiration is slow, but the warmer it gets, the higher the rate of transpiration. And then also wind and the availability of soil water. If the wind speed is low, the rate of transpiration is low. But as wind speed increases and the water on the outside of the plant gets blown away, there's a low water potential on the outside of the plant and the rate of transpiration increases.